It is April 8th, 2026, and the planes are literally sitting on the runway.
Right. Engines running.
Engines running.
Right.
The President of the United States has just declared to the entire world that, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight.
It's just chilling to even think about.
It really is. I mean, we are exactly 90 minutes away from a regional apocalypse here.
Yeah.
90 minutes away from this massive cascade of missiles that would, fundamentally alter the map of the Middle East and just send the global economy into a complete tailspin.
And the margin for error was, it was zero.
Right. And the only thing that stops it, the only thing that pulls the world back from the brink of this totally unprecedented disaster is a backdoor phone call from Islamabad.
Yeah, that is the razor's edge we were operating on. Just a very fragile 11th hour intervention that barely held the pieces together.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We are incredibly glad you're here with us because today we're really pulling apart one of the most tense, high-stakes diplomatic moments in modern history.
So
we're looking at the highly anticipated and honestly incredibly dramatic 21-hour negotiations between the United States and Iran.
the ones that took place in Islamabad in April 2026.
Exactly. Talks that ultimately ended in a total unyielding deadlock, even with this very fragile 2-week ceasefire just sort of hanging over the room.
The stakes here, and I say this without any hyperbole at all, they just could not have been higher for the entire architecture of global security.
Yeah, and we have a massive stack of sources to get through today. We're synthesizing international reports from Al Jazeera, the media line.
Plus those really rigorous geopolitical policy briefs from the Center for International Strategic Studies.
Right, CISS Pakistan, along with deep historical analyses and on-the-ground reporting from the Times of India and the Pakistan Observer.
It's a lot of material.
It's a ton, and we've pulled all of this together to execute a very specific mission for you today. We are going to explain exactly why these talks collapsed despite monumental mediation efforts by Pakistan.
And we really need to unpack what this means on a practical level, Because the failure of this negotiation, it isn't just some abstract political drama confined to a hotel room in South Asia.
No, not at all. We are going to connect this directly to you. From the price of gas at your local station to your grocery bills to the shifting balance of global power that you live under every single day.
It touches everything.
It really does. But before we get into the timeline of that 90-minute countdown, I need to set a clear, non-negotiable parameter for you, the listener.
Right, the neutrality piece.
Exactly. Our sources today contain highly politically charged narratives from both the American and Iranian perspectives. There are deeply conflicting viewpoints, and the rhetoric used by both sides is, it's incredibly intense.
Very intense.
So our job here is not to endorse either side. We are absolutely not taking sides. We're just going to impartially report on these viewpoints, analyzing the architecture of their arguments, and conveying the ideas exactly as they appear in the source material.
So you can clearly understand the actual mechanics of this diplomatic breakdown.
Right.
Because you cannot diagnose a failure of this magnitude without looking at the blueprints both sides brought to the table with complete objectivity.
Yeah.
If you inject bias, you just miss the structural flaws that caused the collapse in the first place.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we look at the massive global fallout, the shipping crises, the economic shocks, we have to look inside that room at the Serena Hotel in Islamabad.
We really need to see the anatomy of the breakdown.
Exactly. We need to see what went wrong during those 21 hours of closed-door meetings, because this was the first direct face-to-face engagement between Washington and Tehran in over a decade.
And the cast of characters selected for this encounter, it was highly specific.
Oh, absolutely.
The level of seniority in that room signaled that this wasn't just some exploratory committee, right?
Right. On the U.S. side, you have Vice President J.D. Vance leading the delegation, and he's accompanied by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner.
And Kushner has an extensive, deeply entrenched history of Middle East deal-making from the previous Trump administration.
Right. And then on the Iranian side, you have Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. These are heavyweights.
They absolutely are.
These are not low-level bureaucrats trying to draft a preliminary memo.
No, sending the vice president and the parliament speaker sends a very distinct message to the international community. It says, we have the institutional authority to sign a deal right here, right now.
But having the authority to make a deal and actually having the willingness to make one.
Those are two entirely different concepts.
Yeah.
The problem was the framework they brought into the room. They weren't there to find a middle ground.
I want to look closely at the clash of proposals because it's just staggering how far apart they were from minute one. I mean, the United States walks in with a 15-point proposal.
A very strict 15-point proposal.
According to the CISS briefs and diplomatic leaks, Washington's demand was absolute. They required a permanent, verifiable commitment from Iran to never pursue nuclear weapons.
Right.
They wanted complete limitations on all ballistic missile programs, and they demanded an immediate, unconditional reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
And J.D. Vance framed these not as starting points for negotiation, but as Washington's quote-unquote red lines.
Red lines.
Yeah. And pay close attention to the phrasing, permanent guarantee.
Why is that so important?
Because in international law, that is a massive escalation from temporary assurances. We saw conditional limitations in past frameworks, but the U.S. delegation in Islamabad was demanding an absolute, irreversible dismantling of Iran's strategic capabilities.
And they wanted compliance immediately.
Exactly. They were essentially looking for a surrender document.
So Iran hears this list of absolute demands, and their response is to just slide their own 10-point counterproposal across the mahogany table.
Right, and it's basically the mirror opposite of a concession.
It really is. Tehran demands a firm, ironclad commitment against any future U.S. or Israeli military attacks on their soil. They demand continued sovereignty and structural control over the Strait of Hormuz.
They even went as far as demanding the right to collect transit fees from international shipping.
Which is wild. Plus, they want official recognition of their right to peaceful uranium enrichment. They want all primary and secondary economic sanctions lifted entirely.
Oh, and war reparations for the damage inflicted.
Right, reparations. And, just to top it all off, they demand a timeline for U.S. military withdrawal from the entire region.
It's just the psychology driving these maximalist demands is what makes this so complex.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that both delegations walked into the Serena Hotel genuinely believing they were operating from a position of ultimate unassailable strength.
Wait, I need to stop you there. How is taking a reported 13,000 missile strikes to your own infrastructure a position of strength?
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. I mean, the U.S. had just spent 6 weeks devastating Iranian military and nuclear sites. That included the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei on February 28.
Right.
To the average observer, taking that level of structural damage sounds like a catastrophic loss. How does the Iranian leadership actually justify that to themselves, let alone their people, as a victory?
It requires looking at the situation through the specific ideological lens of the Iranian state. You see, the Iranian system is built around a concept called Velayat-e-Faqih.
Okay.
For those unfamiliar, this is the foundational Islamic legal doctrine that justifies the supreme leader's absolute religious and political authority over the state.
Right.
And this system is physically protected by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Which functions as like an elite parallel military, right?
Exactly. It's designed specifically to prevent internal coups and foreign interference.
So the IRGC's entire reason for existing is to ensure the regime survives literally any threat.
Precisely that. So when the world's preeminent superpower and its regional allies unleash an unprecedented 6-week bombardment, the U.S. expects the Velayat-e-Faqih system to buckle.
Sure.
Washington viewed the destruction of physical infrastructure and the assassination of Khamenei as the definition of dominance. They felt they had bombed Iran into submission.
Yeah, I mean, J.D. Vance essentially stated publicly that Washington viewed the talks as a venue for Iran to comply, not to negotiate.
Exactly. The U.S. thinks they've won the war, they just need Iran to sign the receipt.
Sign the receipt, right.
But flip the lens to Tehran's perspective. For the IRGC and the surviving Iranian leadership, the fact that their state apparatus did not collapse under 13,000 strikes.
That's proof of their invulnerability.
Exactly. When Khamenei was killed, a 3-person leadership council seamlessly took over. The institutional continuity held.
Wow.
To Tehran, surviving an existential assault by the United States means you have defeated their objective of regime change. And if you survive their worst, you don't capitulate, you dictate terms.
That structural delusion explains so much. I mean, if both sides are completely convinced they just won the war, they have absolutely zero incentive to give up any leverage.
Not at all.
The sources, specifically the analysis from Insight Rush, describe this not as diplomacy, but as ultimatums disguised as diplomacy.
And that mutual perception of victory fatally doomed the room. It created a fundamentally impossible dynamic where any compromise felt like snatching defeat from the jaws of victory.
It sounds like two people showing up to sign divorce papers, but neither is willing to give up the house, so they just yell at each other for 21 hours. Was this an actual negotiation or just a theater of demands?
Well, we see that impossible dynamic reflected in the physical atmosphere of the room. I mean, Pakistani intelligence and diplomatic sources on the ground reported intense mood swings.
Mood swings.
Yeah, and violently fluctuating temperatures during those 21 hours.
Yeah.
Like, there was a highly specific, very heated dispute over frozen Iranian assets held in foreign banks.
Oh, right. Iranian sources began leaking to the press that the U.S. had agreed to release a tranche of these funds to grease the wheels of the negotiation.
Yes. Meanwhile, American officials were completely, flatly denying it, stating no such agreement was ever made.
Which points to a total collapse in shared reality.
Exactly. When delegations have deeply conflicting narratives about what is actually on the table while they are actively sitting at the table.
You can't function.
Right. The basic mechanics of diplomacy cannot function. You can't trade concessions if you can't even agree on what a concession looks like.
And if you're wondering why a diplomatic red line over frozen assets or ballistic missiles in an Islamabad hotel matters to you, consider this. The very moment J.D. Vance put that 15-point ultimatum on the table and the Iranian delegation pushed back.
The markets reacted.
Right. Global shipping insurers monitoring the talks began drafting the premium hikes that will hit your grocery bill next month. The stubbornness in that room immediately translates to the cost of global logistics.
Because the market realizes instantly that this isn't a negotiation, it's a standoff.
But this rigidity, these massive mood swings, they don't just spawn out of nowhere. You don't get 21 hours of pure, unyielding stubbornness just based on a 6-week bombing campaign.
No, you don't.
To really understand the temperature in that room, we have to look at the psychological baggage both of these delegations dragged into Islamabad.
History was the third uninvited delegation in that room.
Yeah.
You just cannot separate Iranian diplomatic behavior in 2026 from the collective trauma of the 20th century.
Okay, let's trace the mechanics of that history. Because if you are an Iranian diplomat, your baseline behavior, your default setting when sitting across from an American envoy, is deeply rooted in the 1953 coup d'etat.
Yes, absolutely.
For those who might need a quick refresher on the mechanics of that event, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
Right.
He made the decision to nationalize Iran's oil reserves, which had previously been controlled by British interests.
And in response, the U.S. and the U.K. orchestrated a covert operation to overthrow him.
Exactly. They consolidated power back into the hands of the Shah, a monarch who was incredibly friendly to Western interests.
And we have to examine how that specific event physically altered the Iranian political consciousness.
How so?
Well, it didn't just cause temporary anger. It planted a structural, institutional belief that the United States is fundamentally an external manipulator.
Right.
In the Iranian state narrative, America cannot be trusted to honor another nation's sovereignty if it conflicts with American economic interests.
It's the emotional anchor of their foreign policy, and the timeline just reinforces it.
Yeah.
You walk forward to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which overthrows that U.S.-backed Shah. That leads directly to the 1979 hostage crisis, where American diplomats were held captive in Tehran for 444 days.
And that event cemented the hostility on the American side.
Yeah, for Washington, that was a profound, televised humiliation.
And a fundamental breach of the most sacred diplomatic norms.
Yeah.
The psychological scars are entirely mutual here.
Wow.
And if we bring this into the modern era, you have the collapse of the JCPOA.
The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal.
Yes. The agreement brokered in 2015, where Iran agreed to strict limits on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief.
And the U.S. unilaterally walked away from that agreement in 2018 under the first Trump administration.
Right. Despite international monitors, including the IAEA, verifying that Iran was complying with the technical parameters of the deal.
So mechanically speaking, if you are the Iranian delegation in Islamabad in 2026, and the American vice president is demanding a permanent guarantee, That phrase is almost insulting.
It's completely insulting to them.
Your historical experience tells you that an American guarantee is mathematically only valid until the next U.S. election cycle.
Exactly. This is where we need to apply some of the sociological frameworks mentioned in the source material, because it gives us a language to understand what looks like irrational stubbornness.
Okay, let's get into the frameworks.
The sources discuss a concept called constructivism, specifically referencing the work of international relations scholar Alexander Wendt.
I want to spend some time on this because it's a brilliant framework to take to a dinner party. How does constructivism actually explain the breakdown in Islamabad?
So constructivism argues that the international system isn't just a cold mechanical board game driven by hard military power or raw economics.
Right.
It argues that international relations are physically shaped by ideas, narratives, and social structures.
So what people believe matters just as much as what they have.
Exactly. It means that the way a nation views its own history alters its foreign policy calculus just as much as its defense budget does. For Iran, resisting Western hegemony isn't just a policy choice. It has literally become their state identity.
And the sources also pair this with social identity theory, which suggests nations behave a lot like individuals defending their group identity.
Yes.
If your entire identity is built on the concept of resisting an oppressor, then compromising with that oppressor doesn't feel like a diplomatic trade. It feels like erasing your own existence.
Exactly that. And it works both ways. Constructivism shows us how the U.S. views Iran, too.
Right.
Washington doesn't look at Tehran and see a nation with complex domestic security concerns or legitimate defensive needs.
No.
The narrative structure in Washington frames Iran entirely through the lens of threat, state-sponsored terrorism, and regional destabilization.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When you view an adversary purely as a rogue actor, your only diplomatic tool becomes containment and coercion.
But if both sides know this, if they are both fully aware that their historical memory is completely poisoning the well, why agree to talk at all? Are they just performing for their domestic audiences?
That's a huge part of it, yes.
Are they just checking a diplomatic box so they can say, well, we tried the peaceful route, time to warm up the bombers again?
Well, in modern geopolitics, entering into talks is very often designed to manage a conflict, not to resolve it.
Oh, interesting.
You go to the table to buy time, to gather intelligence on your adversary's baseline demands, or to shift the global blame when the talks inevitably fail. The sources highlight an incredibly potent concept here called narrative conditioning.
How does that work in practice?
The delegations are playing to entirely different global audiences. Western media, and by extension U.S. diplomats, focus heavily on policy metrics, security outcomes, non-proliferation verification, ballistic missile ranges.
Right, the hard numbers.
Exactly. But regional media in the Middle East and Iranian diplomats, they focus heavily on emotion, sovereignty, historical rights, and the legacy of imperialism.
Oh, wow.
They're sitting at the same table, but they're speaking two entirely different narrative languages.
Which perfectly explains why an American demand for a verifiable security commitment is processed by an Iranian negotiator as a demand for imperial capitulation.
Spot on. And all of this psychological mistrust, this dense web of historical baggage and narrative conditioning,
It didn't just float in the air as abstract theory in Islamabad.
no, it manifested physically. It was concentrated into one very specific, very narrow strip of water.
The Strait of Hormuz. But all this historical posturing would be meaningless if Iran didn't have a physical way to force the world to listen. And they found that physical leverage right there.
It is the ultimate leverage trap.
Let's lay out the sheer scale of the Strait of Hormuz for you, the listener, because the data is absolutely staggering. Just how much of the global economy actually floats through that specific choke point.
We're talking about a waterway that handles roughly 20% of all globally traded oil.
20%?
Yeah, that equates to about 25 to 30% of all seaborne crude oil. You were looking at roughly 15 to 20 million barrels moving through that strait every single day.
That is insane.
Furthermore, 1/5 of the entire global liquefied natural gas, or LNG, trade passes through those waters.
It is essentially the global economy's jugular vein. And when the conflict escalated, Iran effectively blockaded it.
Right.
But during the talks, their demand wasn't just to revert to the status quo. They demanded greater sovereign control over the strait, going as far as asserting the right to physically collect transit fees from international shipping vessels.
A demand the United States categorically rejected.
Of
For Washington, ensuring free, Unhindered navigation through the Strait of Hormuz is not simply about keeping gas prices low in the Midwest. It is a core strategic pillar of maintaining American global leadership.
Right. The U.S. Navy's role as the ultimate guarantor of global maritime trade is fundamental to the unipolar world order.
Exactly. If Washington allows Iran to unilaterally tax or restrict that route, they are surrendering a piece of their global hegemony.
The mechanical metaphor that comes to mind here isn't a door that you can just prop open or lock shut. It's a vascular system.
I like that analogy.
Iran essentially has its hand wrapped around the world's neck. But if they squeeze that jugular too hard, they also cut off their own circulation. Iran's economy is desperate to sell oil. How long can they realistically hold this grip before they pass out themselves?
That is the exact mechanism of the leverage trap detailed in the CISS policy brief. Iran's total reliance on Hormuz as their ultimate pressure point actually boxed them in diplomatically. Because they made it such an untouchable, sacred asset, and because they tied their national pride and strategic survival to their ability to close it, compromise became politically impossible for Tehran.
Right. If you draw your ultimate weapon, you can't easily put it back in the holster without looking like you've surrendered.
Precisely. The leverage becomes a trap.
But surely the global architecture has alternative routes. I mean, we can't be this paralyzingly dependent on a choke point that is barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point.
Oh, we are exactly that dependent. The math on the alternative routes is just grim.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you look at the infrastructure, you have the East-West pipeline traversing Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea.
Okay.
And you have the Habshan-Fujairah corridor bypassing the strait through the UAE.
Right, so we have pipelines.
But if you run both of those pipelines at their absolute maximum red line capacity, pushing every drop of oil they can physically handle, you replace less than half of the volume that typically moves through Hormuz.
Less than half. That is terrifying.
You simply cannot physically pump the oil fast enough over land to replace the supertankers.
Wow.
And the mechanics of the crisis get worse when you look at natural gas. Qatar's immense LNG exports are structurally dependent on Hormuz. There is no pipeline alternative for them to bypass the strait.
None at all.
None.
Yeah.
When Qatar is forced to suspend LNG production and supply because the waterway is too dangerous, it generates immediate severe gas price pressures across Europe and Asia. So Iran's leverage is incredibly potent, which structurally enforces their stubbornness at the negotiating table.
Okay, so let's look at the board. We have decades of historical trauma, an irreconcilable clash of identities, 21 hours of screaming over impossible demands, and the global economy's jugular vein being actively choked out.
It's a mess.
A mediator in this scenario wasn't just helpful. A mediator was desperately needed to physically pull the world back from the brink of a wider war.
Enter Pakistan.
Right. Stepping into a high-wire role that, honestly, very few analysts expected they could execute.
What Pakistan achieved in those final hours was a diplomatic miracle. The mechanisms of what they're calling the Islamabad Accord are going to be studied in international relations seminars for decades.
Let's take you back to the mechanics of that April 8 countdown to understand this 90-minute miracle. The tension is unbearable. Trump is threatening to bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages.
He officially declares Tuesday as Power Plant Day and Bridge Day,
telling the world via social media that a whole civilization will die tonight. The rhetoric is apocalyptic.
Yeah.
And with literally 90 minutes to spare before the bombers cross the threshold, Pakistan intervenes and secures a 2-week ceasefire. How did the phone calls actually work? How do you stop a war with 90 minutes on the clock?
It required a highly calibrated combination of old-school shuttle diplomacy, modern timing, and crucially highly specific personal relationships.
Right.
The architects of this intervention were Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, his deputy and foreign minister Ishaq Dar, and perhaps most importantly, the Army Chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir.
I want to focus on Field Marshal Munir because his leverage here is totally unique.
It really is.
The sources highlight a highly significant Oval Office meeting he had with Donald Trump back in June 2025. Apparently, Trump took a strong liking to him, famously calling Munir his favorite field marshal during a political rally in Ohio.
Yeah, that quote made headlines.
How did that personal connection physically alter the timeline on April 8?
Having a direct, trusted human line to the Oval Office was the circuit breaker.
Wow.
While U.S. planes were literally idling on the runway, Munir was able to bypass the lower diplomatic channels and stay on the phone directly with Vice President J.D. Vance and Donald Trump.
That's incredible.
But personal rapport only buys you a conversation, right? It doesn't buy you a treaty. You need a mechanical framework to break the standoff. And that's where the Islamabad Accord strategy was brilliant.
Walk us through the mechanics of that strategy.
Pakistan utilized a two-tier approach to split the deadlock. Washington's position was, we will not stop bombing until Tehran moves first. Tehran's position was, we will not open the Strait of Hormuz until the bombardment stops.
Right.
Neither side could physically afford the domestic optics of moving first, because moving first looks like weakness.
So how do you solve a Mexican standoff where no one will lower their weapon?
You create a framework where both sides lower them at the exact same millisecond. Pakistan engineered an agreement where Trump agreed to officially suspend the bombing campaign for 2 weeks. And in that precise moment, Iran agreed to allow safe passage for commercial shipping in Hormuz under their own military oversight for 2 weeks.
Oh, that's clever.
By making the actions reciprocal and entirely simultaneous, Pakistan provided a narrative off-ramp. It allowed both adversaries to claim a tactical victory and completely avoid the optics of retreat.
It transformed a unilateral demand into a mirrored commitment. That is fascinating.
Very smart diplomacy.
But here's where I have to push back on the broader narrative. Pakistan is being hailed globally as the hero of this story, the ultimate peacemaker.
Yeah, they got a lot of praise.
But let's be real about geopolitics. Nations do not act out of pure altruistic charity. They don't insert themselves between two heavily armed superpowers just to win a Nobel Prize. What was the physical, structural incentive for Islamabad? Why take on the immense risk of hosting this powder keg?
Because Pakistan's geographic and demographic positioning makes them structurally vulnerable to this specific conflict. Pakistan is what analysts refer to as a bridge state.
A bridge state?
Yeah. Look at their map. They are the world's only nuclear-capable Muslim country. They maintain a vital mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia, which naturally aligns their security interests with the West and the Gulf states.
Right.
But simultaneously, they share a highly porous 1,000-kilometer border with Iran.
So they are physically sandwiched between the primary combatants.
Exactly. Field Marshal Munir's logic, according to the internal sources, was entirely pragmatic. Pakistan simply cannot secure its own borders if the broader Gulf region is on fire.
That makes sense.
Protecting shipping routes to the port of Karachi and ensuring the safety of Pakistani pilgrims traveling to religious sites in Mashhad, Iran, isn't some abstract foreign policy objective. For Islamabad, it is a matter of urgent, existential home defense.
Wow.
They stepped in because the alternative was watching a regional war bleed directly into their own territory.
Which brings us perfectly to the domestic reality Pakistan was facing. The cost of peace. Pakistan didn't just want this ceasefire, they fundamentally, mathematically needed it to survive.
Yes, they did.
So Pakistan is essentially walking a tightrope over a volcano while juggling flaming swords. They're balancing the West, their Saudi defense pact, their own economy, and their domestic population. Did this pressure make them better mediators or desperate ones?
Well, let's look at that economic engine you mentioned. The economic constraints on Pakistan were a ticking time bomb during these negotiations.
Right, let's break down how their macroeconomy actually functions.
Pakistan is heavily structurally dependent on imported fuel to keep its lights on and its factories running. At the time of these talks, they were desperately trying to stabilize a fragile macroeconomic program with the IMF.
Explain how the IMF crunch is actually dependent on the events in the Strait of Hormuz.
It comes down to the import bill. If the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, global oil prices skyrocket.
Yeah.
Because Pakistan imports its fuel, their national import bill explodes overnight.
Okay.
When the import bill explodes, their foreign exchange reserves drain rapidly, domestic inflation spirals out of control, and the strict fiscal targets set by the IMF are instantly wiped out. The entire economic stabilization plan disintegrates.
And it's not just the cost of what they buy, it's the threat to their income. Let's look at the mechanics of remittances.
Huge factor.
The sources point out that Pakistan hit a record $38.3 billion in remittances in the fiscal year 2025. For the listener, remittances are the funds that citizens working abroad send back to their families in their home country. That money is the lifeblood of Pakistan's economy. It is structurally central to them achieving their first current account surplus in 14 years. And where does the bulk of that money physically originate?
Nearly half of it flows directly from the Gulf. $9.3 billion from Saudi Arabia and $7.9 billion from the UAE.
Those numbers are massive.
Millions of Pakistani laborers and professionals are deployed across those Gulf states, working in construction, healthcare, and engineering. If a wider regional war breaks out involving Saudi and Emirati infrastructure.
Yeah, and we know historically that Iranian proxy missiles have targeted those exact areas.
Exactly. If that happens, those millions of workers are at immediate risk of displacement.
So if the Gulf becomes a war zone, the workers flee and the money stops. Pakistan's economy basically collapses from both ends simultaneously. Skyrocketing fuel costs on one side and evaporating remittance income on the other.
It is an economic death spiral.
Just brutal.
But the pressure wasn't purely financial. The domestic unrest bubbling inside Pakistan was reaching a boiling point. Pakistan has a large Shia Muslim population, estimated at roughly 15 to 20% of the country.
Okay.
They are watching the assassination of Iranian Shia leaders and the destruction of Iranian infrastructure very closely.
How did that sectarian pressure physically manifest during the crisis?
We saw serious violence break out very early in the conflict. On March 1st, protesters actively attempted to storm the U.S. consulate in Karachi to condemn the American assassination of Iran's supreme leader.
Oh, wow.
Security forces engaged to disperse them, and at least 10 people were killed in the clashes. The situation was so volatile that the Pakistani military command had to summon prominent clerics to their headquarters in Rawalpindi to explicitly forcefully warn that domestic sectarian violence would not be tolerated.
And there's the border threat, too. The CIS's policy brief specifically highlighted the immense risk to Pakistan's Balochistan province. If the Iranian regime were to actually collapse under the weight of sustained U.S. strikes, what happens to that 3,000-kilometer border?
You face a catastrophic vacuum. Pakistan feared a massive, uncontrolled influx of refugees pouring across the border.
Right.
And worse, they feared the activation of cross-border militancy. Groups like the Balochistan Liberation Army, the BLA, thrive in chaotic, stateless environments.
I see.
If Iranian border security collapsed, these militant groups could exploit the vacuum to launch attacks deep into Pakistani territory, creating an absolute security nightmare for Islamabad.
So connecting all these mechanics together, this immense vulnerability, this sheer economic and domestic desperation on Pakistan's part, how did that actually influence their role as a mediator? Did it make them look weak in the room?
Counterintuitively, it's exactly what made them such effective mediators. It built deep structural trust.
How does desperation build trust?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, regional actors, especially deeply invested Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, recognized that Pakistan had maximum skin in the game. Saudi Arabia demonstrated immense strategic patience during Iran's provocations because they understood the fragile architecture of the region. When Pakistan approached Riyadh and Washington pushing for de-escalation, everyone knew Islamabad wasn't acting out of some abstract philosophical desire for world peace.
Right.
They were acting out of a vital, measurable national security imperative to prevent their own economic and social collapse.
That makes a lot of sense. You trust the guy trying to put out the fire if his house is attached to yours.
Exactly.
They were a highly reliable broker because they literally could not afford to fail. But while Pakistan was taking all the heat, sweating under the intense stage lights, managing the phone calls, and hosting the 21-hour marathon, there was a massive silent power operating in the shadows of this negotiation.
Yes, there was.
A country subtly shifting the gravitational pull of the entire region without ever formally taking a seat at the Serena Hotel.
China, the unseen structural variable that alters every diplomatic equation in the modern Middle East.
Let's trace China's fingerprints on this crisis. On March 31st, while the U.S. bombing campaign was still highly active, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar made a very deliberate, highly publicized visit to Beijing.
Yes, he met directly with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi.
And out of that meeting came a joint 5-point initiative.
It was essentially the first structured, multilateral framework aimed at restoring peace. Mechanically, it called for an immediate cessation of hostilities, a return to peace talks, civilian protection protocols, restoring commercial shipping through Hormuz, and mandating a larger role for the UN Security Council.
Wow.
And while Pakistan served as the public face of this push in Islamabad, China's geoeconomic stakes operating in the background were massive.
Walk us through China's physical dependence on the region.
China imports roughly 40% of its entire crude oil supply from the Persian Gulf.
40%.
Their industrial base, their manufacturing sector, their entire economic growth model requires that oil to flow uninterrupted. They need the Strait of Hormuz open just as desperately as Western markets do.
But their relationship with Iran goes much deeper than just buying oil on the open market, right? Iran is a critical partner in China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Vastly deeper. China and Iran previously signed a comprehensive 25-year strategic and economic partnership agreement.
25 years.
China is deeply invested in modernizing Iran's infrastructure, its telecommunications, and its energy sector. Furthermore, in 2023, it was Beijing that stepped in to formally broker the normalization of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
So China has systematically positioned itself as the alternative power broker in the Middle East. They are standing in the back of the room, not saying a word, but their mere presence completely changes how Iran plays its hand.
It does.
Does China actually want this conflict resolved quickly to secure their oil shipments? Or are they strategically content watching the United States bleed resources and political capital in another unwinnable Middle Eastern quagmire?
That is the defining duality of Chinese foreign policy. On a macroeconomic level, yes, they absolutely require the Strait of Hormuz to remain open for their own immediate energy security. A long-term closure of that waterway is devastating to Chinese industrial output.
Right.
However, on a long-term geopolitical level, China benefits immensely from prolonged regional instability that inherently challenges U.S. dominance, drains American military resources, and forces Washington to focus on the Middle East rather than the Indo-Pacific.
It's a strategic win-win for Beijing, even if it hurts their wallet in the short term.
It is. But more importantly for the talks in Islamabad, China's implicit backing gave Tehran the structural confidence to resist immediate American demands.
I see.
When J.D. Vance slapped that 15-point proposal down on the table, demanding permanent nuclear dismantlement and a surrender of sovereign rights, Iran didn't have to capitulate because they knew they possessed a massive economic and diplomatic lifeline in Beijing.
Even Donald Trump noted during a press interaction that China played a significant role in pushing Iran to the table in the first place.
Exactly. Chinese quiet diplomacy fundamentally altered the architecture of the negotiations. It provided an alternative center of gravity to Washington.
Yeah.
It effectively killed the unipolar dynamic of the early 2000s, the idea that what America dictates, the world must accept that the U.S. negotiating team was clearly still trying to rely on.
The U.S. delegation walked into that hotel acting like it was 2003, expecting unilateral submission. And Iran simply looked over Washington's shoulder at Beijing and said, "It's 2026. You aren't the only superpower in the room anymore."
Precisely. The fundamental leverage of the global system had shifted, and the American delegation hadn't fully priced that multipolar reality into their ultimatums.
Okay, so the talks failed. The 21 hours ended in deadlock. The U.S. delegation left furious. J.D. Vance gave a highly blunt assessment to the press, stating it was bad news for Iran, much more than it's bad news for the United States.
And Iran's foreign ministry countered by calling the U.S. demands excessive and unlawful.
China remains quietly in the shadows. Pakistan is holding its breath, hoping the engine doesn't seize. So what happens to you, the listener, right now, today? Because this story is not over.
It is far from over. The macroeconomic transmission channels are already actively pushing the consequences of this diplomatic failure directly into your daily life.
Let's break down those mechanisms.
Yeah.
How does a failed talk in Islamabad hit the listener's wallet? We've talked broadly about oil prices, but let's trace the actual ripple effects through the supply chain.
When crude oil prices spike due to instability in Hormuz, it doesn't just make your morning commute more expensive at the gas pump. Crude oil is a foundational, non-substitutable component for global agriculture. Modern farming requires immense amounts of petroleum-based fertilizers. As oil spikes, fertilizer prices elevate immediately.
Which means the cost to grow a bushel of wheat or corn skyrockets.
Exactly. And those elevated production costs are passed directly to the consumer. Food prices at your local grocery store climb. Simultaneously, household energy bills surge as natural gas markets react to the instability.
It hits you everywhere.
And then you have the compounding disaster of the shipping crisis. Because Hormuz is designated a high-risk zone and the wider Gulf is effectively an active war zone, massive commercial vessels are being forced to reroute.
They're going entirely around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa to reach Europe and the Americas, right?
Yeah.
How much time and cost does that reroute actually add?
It adds weeks to the transit times and burns massive unplanned amounts of extra bunker fuel. And the global insurance sector reacts violently to these risks. War risk insurance premiums for maritime shipping have spiked exponentially.
I can imagine.
In some cases, underwriters have simply withdrawn Gulf coverage entirely.
And if you can't legally insure a $100 million supertanker, you cannot move that supertanker.
Exactly. That translates geopolitical instability directly into higher global trade costs for virtually every imported good, from consumer electronics to basic grain shipments. You pay for the failure of these talks every time you swipe your credit card.
And all of this economic pain is happening while we are supposedly operating under a ceasefire. But we need to look at how incredibly fragile this ceasefire actually is.
Like, very fragile.
Yes. The 90-minute miracle of the Islamabad Accord paused the direct U.S.-Iran bombing campaign. Yes, global oil markets briefly breathed a sigh of relief, dropping $18 from their peak when the pause was officially announced. But the core structural issues remain completely, dangerously unresolved. And the ceasefire itself is full of deadly, active loopholes.
The most glaring loophole being the situation in Lebanon.
Walk us through the mechanics of that exclusion.
When Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif publicly announced the ceasefire agreement, he claimed it broadly included Lebanon and elsewhere in the region.
Okay.
But the Israeli government immediately and publicly denied this interpretation. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office issued a clarification stating that the ceasefire agreement did not include operations in Lebanon.
Oh, wow.
And Israeli military strikes continued unabated against Iran-backed Hezbollah militants, resulting in dozens of casualties.
So you have a highly touted regional ceasefire that doesn't actually stop the shooting in one of the most volatile, heavily armed proxy battlegrounds in the world.
Which demonstrates how localized the agreement actually was.
Right.
It paused the direct superpower confrontation, but left the proxy wars burning.
Which brings us to the terrifying precedent this entire 6-week conflict is setting for the future of global security. We need to talk about the threat of preemptive warfare.
This is a deeply crucial point raised by the analysts in the CISS policy brief. We have to look at the sequence of events.
Okay.
The United States and Israel launched coordinated massive military strikes on February 28, successfully assassinating the supreme leader of a sovereign state and systematically degrading its military infrastructure.
Entirely without United Nations Security Council authorization.
Exactly.
And what was the legal justification provided for that strike?
That is the alarming part. The Pentagon briefings provided to Congress indicated they possessed no actionable intelligence or evidence that Iran was planning an imminent direct attack on American forces or the U.S. homeland.
Wait, so they didn't strike to stop an incoming attack. They struck preemptively to force regime change.
Exactly. And when the international community tolerates the overt, unilateral use of preemptive military force against the sovereign state's leadership to achieve political regime change,
it drastically lowers the threshold for similar actions globally.
it makes preemptive strikes normatively acceptable.
It fragments the entire geopolitical rules-based order. I mean, if the U.S. can preemptively strike Iran without UN authorization simply because they view the regime as a long-term threat, what stops other regional powers from applying that exact same logic to their own adversaries?
Nothing stops them. And looking at what comes next in this specific standoff, it's incredibly grim.
Yeah.
The U.S. is already signaling highly aggressive containment measures, publicly floating the idea of enforcing a maritime blockade to physically inspect Iranian shipping.
And Iran's Supreme National Security Council is openly warning that despite the temporary diplomatic pause, their hands remain firmly on the trigger.
Right.
So what does this all mean for the architecture of the world? Are we just sitting in a fragile waiting room before a larger inevitable war? Or is this the dark new normal, a constant state of high anxiety containment where the global economy is just held hostage every few months?
This raises an important question about the fundamental limits of American strategic power in the 21st century. The U.S.'s outdated playbook of absolute military coercion fundamentally failed in Islamabad.
They could not dictate terms.
Conversely, Iran's strategy of maximum resistance via the Hormuz choke point trapped them in an impossible diplomatic corner.
Right.
Because the United States and Iran are seemingly utterly incapable of resolving their own structural conflicts without an external stabilizer like Pakistan stepping in at the literal 11th hour, the world is locked into a perpetual cycle of brinkmanship.
We are in an era where peace is merely managed. It is paused week by week, crisis by crisis. It is not achieved.
It's permanent crisis management masquerading as international diplomacy.
We have covered immense ground today. We looked inside the Serena Hotel at 21 hours of intractable ultimatums. Two heavily armed delegations talking completely past each other, their positions built on decades of historical trauma tracing all the way back to 1953.
Yes.
We saw how the memory of that trauma physically altered their ability to compromise, and how that stubbornness was fought over the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical economic vascular system. We explored how Pakistan performed an absolute diplomatic miracle, driven not by altruism, but by the severe mechanical realities of their own economic and domestic desperation, managing a high-wire act to save their own country from the fallout.
A really precarious position.
We saw China silently shifting the weights on the scale, breaking the unipolar illusion of American dominance. And it all ended in a wall of stubborn intent, leaving the global supply chain and your wallet incredibly vulnerable to the next spark.
The structural historical divides were simply too deep, and the mutual perceptions of victory too blinding for a single 21-hour session to bridge. But the very fact that they were forced to sit down at all is a profound testament to the shifting dynamics of global mediation.
And that brings me to a final lingering thought for you to ponder as you step back into your day. We are all directly physically tied to these events through the inflation of the goods we buy, the energy bills we pay, and the broader stability of the world we live in.
We really are.
Today, we saw two immense superpowers, the United States and Iran, who were entirely, fundamentally incapable of managing their own escalation. They relied on a middle power, Pakistan, a country dealing with its own severe, overlapping economic crises to literally save them from themselves.
Yeah.
So I leave you with this question. If the world's greatest powers now require middleweight nations to hit the brakes on global catastrophe, who is really running the global order anymore?
It's a fundamental paradigm shift in how the world operates.
It absolutely is. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the underlying mechanics behind the events, and stay curious. We'll see you next time.